Welcome to my second video lecture for Philosophy 3200 about individual security under anarchy. So this lecture will be about how an anarchist society could hope to protect individuals against crime. So I want to start with a couple of definitions. This was in the previous lecture, but just to review. Government has been defined by Max Weber as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Right now, this definition may not be exactly correct, but there are two key attributes that are widely accepted as being an essential part of government. The fact that the government is coercive and that it's monopolistic. So when we say coercive, what we mean is the government forces people to obey its commands. And the monopolistic aspect is the government prohibits other people or organizations from doing the same thing that the government itself is doing. So in a governmental system, you cannot set up a competing government, or the dominant government will try to shut you down. Now, anarcho-capitalism is a possible type of society that would have no government, but it would have private property, including private ownership of capital. Instead of having government, it would provide governmental services by private institutions. All right, so now how would these private institutions work, and how would they be able to replace the government provision of security? So the idea is, first, the police would be replaced by private security guard companies to protect people from criminals. There would be multiple competing security agencies operating within the same geographical area so that individuals, businesses, homeowners associations, and other organizations could choose what security company they wanted to hire. Now, it happens as a matter of fact that there are more private security guards in the United States at present than there are government police. So in fact, some security is provided privately in the present system, but in the anarcho-capitalist system, the police would be completely privatized. Okay, how would the courts work? So individuals who had disputes with each other would have them resolved by a kind of private court system. Now, there are presently private arbitration firms that some people use to resolve disputes. So businesses commonly resolve disputes through a private arbitration company, which is kind of like a private alternative to the court system. The reason for this being that the court system is too expensive and takes too long. In the anarcho-capitalist system, this practice would be expanded to completely replace the government court system. There would be multiple competing arbitration companies operating in the same geographical area again. In case you're wondering how people who have a dispute with each other could agree upon an arbitrator, a common method is you take a list of the arbitrators who are operating in your area, and you can alternately cross names off the list. You cross off your least favorite arbitrator and they cross off their least favorite, and so on until you arrive at one. Now, in the present system, private contracts frequently specify arbitration as a way of resolving disputes. And in the anarcho-capitalist system, this would become universal. All of your contracts would, disputes about any of them would be resolved by private arbitration. The protection agencies would have arbitration agreements with each other. In case one agency's customer had a dispute with another agency's customer, the two agencies would have an agreement with each other that the dispute should be resolved with some particular arbitration company or by some particular means. It would be agreed in advance. And then the two protection agencies would just follow that, regardless of whether the customers in the individual case wanted to do that. Where would law come from? So law would be made by the arbitrators or by the judges. Now, this is in fact the origin of the British common law, except that it was made by governmental judges. And that is in contrast with legislative law. In the present system, there's still a lot of this judge-made law. And this is where judges make rules in particular cases. So a case comes before a judge, and if there's no previously accepted rule for how to deal with that case, the judge tries to resolve it using what he takes to be the sort of common sense morality of his community. And then he writes down an explanation for why he decided it in that way, and that explanation becomes a precedent for future cases that have similar issues. But in the present system, there's also a lot of legislative law. This is where elected politicians vote to make some particular rule. In the anarcho-capitalist society, there would not be this legislative law. There would only be the common law. Okay, now what are the general advantages that this anarchist system is supposed to have? There are two main differences between the anarchist way of providing law and order and the governmental system. In the governmental system, you're forced to accept the government, so you have to buy their services whether you want it or not. And you have little or no control over what kind of government you get. In the anarcho-capitalist system, you choose to hire a protection agency, you choose whether to hire one or not, and if so, you choose which one. In the government system, there's only one provider of protection, and you just have to buy their services. In the anarcho-capitalist system, you voluntarily choose, and there's competition among different providers. Why is this competition important? So there are a number of problems with having a monopolistic provider. Most people accept that monopoly is a bad system for providing most goods and services, but they don't notice that it is the same system that we have for providing security in the present system, and people don't notice that that has the same problems that would apply to monopolies in other areas. Right, so one of the problems with monopolies is that the organization that has the monopoly doesn't have to worry about being replaced by a competitor, and therefore they can do almost whatever they want. Another problem, as discussed in a previous class, was that if social problems get worse, then the government actually gets more money and power. Because if a social problem worsens, a problem that the government is supposed to be taking care of, then the only alternative people have is to turn to the government. There's no other provider that they can turn to. In the competitive free market system, if a problem gets worse, then the organization that's supposed to be fixing that problem could get fired and replaced with another one. But in our system, you just give more money to the one organization that's supposed to be solving the problem. But that means that they have an incentive to let problems get worse and not to solve them. Also, in the current system, voters don't have any incentive to try to form accurate beliefs because each voter knows that they have little or no chance of actually affecting the outcome of an election. So as a result, they tend to be extremely ignorant, and they tend to think in kind of irrational ways when making their political decisions. So as a consequence of this, in the present system, the government is inefficient, it has very high prices, low quality, and tends to abuse its power. Now, all of these things apply to monopolies generally. This would be true of any organization that had a monopoly on some important service. And there's no reason why it wouldn't also be true of a government monopoly. The advantages of competition are that they improve the incentives and they eliminate inefficient providers. So each provider knows that they have to do their best to try to satisfy the customers, or the customers could turn to one of their competitors. Also, people who are just not good at their job are going to be eliminated. They're just going to be outcompeted, and then they're just going to have to stop doing that job. But if you have a monopoly, you can be very bad at the job and just keep doing it because there's nobody else. Now, you might wonder if all of this really amounts to genuine anarchy, because after all, the so-called anarcho-capitalist system is providing services that are just like the services that the government provides. So you might wonder if it should be called anarchy, or maybe it should be called a system of multiple governments or something like that. But this question really doesn't matter. We shouldn't argue about semantic questions. Now, if you care about the semantic question, the reason this is considered a form of anarchy rather than multiple governments is that the definition of government traditionally includes that it's monopolistic. So if you don't have a monopoly, then you don't have a government. But what actually matters is simply whether this system is importantly different from the status quo and whether it's better. And it is importantly different in these two ways, that you have voluntary purchase of services and that you have multiple competitors. Okay, now I'm going to turn to questions and objections that people raise about the anarcho-capitalist system. So this is perhaps the most popular thing that people say within a few seconds of hearing about this system. They say, so won't the security agencies just be in constant war with each other? Because a customer of one agency will have a dispute with a customer of the other agency, and then the customer will insist that the agency go to war on his behalf, right? And the other customer of the other agency will make the same request, and so then there will be this constant bloodshed. Now, although this is one of the most popular objections that people make, it's also among the least plausible and almost ridiculous. Right, so first of all, these agencies are profit-making businesses, and violence is not profitable. Violence is extremely costly. Now, you can contrast what happens when governments have disputes with each other. Governments actually do very frequently go to war with each other. Private companies do not frequently do that. And one of the reasons is that the government can afford to do this. The government can go to war, and for example, the Iraq War cost something like $3 trillion. No private company would spend $3 trillion or even $1 billion for something that wasn't going to bring them a ton of revenue. But the US government could do that because they don't have to worry about being replaced if they do that. If they spend $3 trillion and they don't get anything for it, they still continue to operate. All right, but a private business is not going to keep operating if it's constantly going to war and constantly spending money. Now, most people in any normal society are opposed to murdering other people. All right, so you're going to have to pay your employees a lot in order to get them to attempt to murder employees of another agency, and indeed, most of them would still refuse to do it. Also, obviously, most employees do not want to be killed themselves. So you definitely have to pay extra money in order to get employees who are willing to go to a war where they themselves were likely to be shot. A much more efficient way of resolving disputes between customers of different agencies is to go to arbitration. That's going to be much less costly. And so that is the method that private companies would settle on. Here's another objection that you might have, and this is also frequently raised. What if you have a security agency that decides to defend criminals, or in other words, to defend murderers, thieves, and so on? Why wouldn't that happen? And then, why wouldn't they be at war with the other agencies that are defending ordinary people? Well, there wouldn't be a security agency to defend criminals or rights violators because that would not be profitable. So the clients of this agency would be constantly costing them money. Compare the explanation for why there's not a fire insurance company for arsonists. Right? No insurance company will sell you insurance for arson. Nor, by the way, so insurance companies will sometimes sell life insurance policies, but they will not sell a policy for suicide. And why is that? Well, this is referred to as a moral hazard problem. The reason they won't do that is they don't want people who are constantly costing them money. They don't want a customer who is extremely likely to, especially intentionally, create the situation that requires them to pay out money. So there's no fire insurance for arsonists because the arsonist would intentionally create the claims. Now, it's a similar problem with the protection agency for criminals because the criminals would be constantly going out starting disputes with other people. The security agency doesn't want their customers to have lots of disputes with people. They want to avoid disputes as much as possible because, disputes are going to be costly. So the least costly thing is for the protection agency to just have people be safe and not run into problems with other people. And then the customers are happy and you don't have to spend a bunch of money. So if there was a protection agency for criminals, that agency would be constantly losing money. They would be fighting a constant war against the rest of society because almost everyone values being protected from crime more than they value the opportunity to commit crimes. and they would have to pay higher wages to their employees in order to get them to participate in these crimes. If you're trying to protect people who are trying to steal property, you would have to charge your clients enough money to make it worth it. And the amount that you'd have to charge the clients would be more than the value of the stolen goods. The reason for this is that the person who originally owned the goods is going to have higher value for those goods than the goods could be sold for on the black market. So stolen goods are generally worth a fraction of the cost of legitimate goods in reality, right? This is like the actual fact. If you steal something and then try to sell it, you can sell it for a fraction of its normal market price. And meanwhile, the original owner would be willing to pay more, much more, to not have it stolen. So what this means is for the Thief Protection Agency to be competitive with normal legitimate protection agencies, the Thief Protection Agency has to charge their clients more money, or at least as much money as the normal protection agencies are charging. But there's no way to make that work because what it's worth to the thieves is much less than what's worth to the legitimate owners. Now, with this objection, as with most of the other objections, the problem actually applies more seriously to the government than it applies to anarcho-capitalism, but people tend to not notice this. So in the current governmental system, you can also have people in the government who work with criminals. You can have corrupt people in the government. You can have crime bosses who pay off the police or bribe judges and so on. And what happens then? There's not a very good answer to that. So if that happens a lot with your government, then you're just kind of screwed. You can't switch to another government. And in fact, there are many governments in the world that have that problem in a very large degree. Here's another sort of philosophical objection that you might have. You might think this anarcho-capitalist system is objectionable, morally objectionable, because justice just shouldn't be for sale. Everybody's entitled to have their rights protected, and they shouldn't have to pay to have them protected. Right, but this really isn't true because, protecting other people's rights costs money. It entails at least some amount of physical risk to the protector. So the people who are providing this protection are surely entitled to compensation for that. Surely they can't be obligated to just protect other people and not get paid anything for it. That being the case, that means that it's legitimate for them to charge money. If they're not paid money, then they just won't provide protection, and so we just won't have people's rights be protected. Of course, it's true in one sense that you shouldn't have to pay for justice, but the fact that you have to pay for justice is an injustice on the part of the criminals. It's not an injustice on the part of the protectors who are charging you money. Okay, note that anarchists can agree that the law should be based on justice just as much as statists can. Now, when I discuss how the system would actually work, I talk in terms of incentives, but that's really exactly the same as the situation with the government or any other society. If you want to predict how things will work in any society, you have to look at what the actual incentives are facing the individuals who are acting in that society. It just happens that anarcho-capitalists are talk a lot more about incentives. In other words, we're just more rational about predicting what should actually be expected to happen than statists are. People who believe in government protection tend to just assume that the government will do what it's supposed to without talking about what incentives would make them do that. Notice finally, again, that this objection applies at least as much to the government as it applies to anarcho-capitalism, because obviously in the governmental system you don't get protection for free either. The government obviously charges money in order to protect your rights, just as the protection agencies in the anarcho-capitalist society would do. The difference is just that the government forces you to pay this money, and you have no choice as to who should provide the protection. You only have the one agency. It's not a difference between whether you have to pay to have your rights protected or not. Okay, another objection. Well, who will protect the poor? Won't the protection agencies only protect the rich in the anarcho-capitalist system? Now, this objection appears to be a result of not thinking about how things actually work in the real world. So if you look at industries in the real world, it's not the case that most industries only provide goods and services for the rich. So contrast Walmart with Bloomingdale's. You may not even know what Bloomingdale's is because it's so small, but it's a department store that caters to rich people, right? It is one of the biggest, it might be the biggest department store that caters to rich people, but you might still have never heard of it. Walmart is obviously much larger and much more powerful. And Walmart, of course, caters to low and middle income shoppers. Why is that? Because there are a lot more of them. Right, and that's just one example. Just across the board, it's just not the case that companies only provide high-end products for the rich. That's close to being the opposite of the truth. Also note that, again, this objection also applies to the governmental system. The poor people are already paying for protection from the state. It's not like you don't have to pay if you have a government, right? Government requires money as well. They're paying through taxes. Now, it happens that they're paying lower rates than the wealthy people, but they are still paying. Also, contrast the problem of who protects the poor in a governmental system, and just consider in reality how well the government is protecting the poor. In fact, they're not doing an extremely good job. The vast majority of crime is committed against poor people. It's also committed by poor people, right? So most of the crime occurs in poor neighborhoods, and the government is not, in fact, doing a lot to stop that problem, right? Okay, another possible objection. You might wonder how good private protection would be. You might just think, well, maybe we shouldn't take the risk because the government is doing a good job of protecting us. I don't know if anybody thinks that. But probably the quality of protection services under the anarcho-capitalist society would be better than the quality under the governmental society. And the reason for this is just in general that monopolies are not very efficient. They tend to not produce high quality or high quantity. They tend to produce high prices, and in general people tend to be less satisfied with the product. So on general economic grounds, you'd expect that the competitive mechanism for providing protection would be better. It would provide higher quality protection, i.e., probably people would be safer. They'd probably have to pay less money. They would probably be overall better satisfied. The customers would probably be less likely to get beaten up or shot by their protectors, because if you shoot one of your clients, that tends to put a dent in your business. And contrast that with the case of government police. If the government police shoot one of their, quote, clients, i.e. they shoot an innocent citizen, not very much happens to them. They don't get fired. The police department doesn't get fired, and the people do not go and choose a different police department because there is no other police department. If you look at the effectiveness of government provision of protection, it's not very impressive. So these are government statistics. This is from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports, and this is the percentage of offenses known to the police that were cleared by arrest or exceptional means. Okay, what this means is there was a crime that the police knew about, so it was reported to them, which, by the way, is a minority of all crimes. Most crimes are probably not reported to the police, and we don't know how many unreported crimes there are. Okay, but this is for crimes that were reported to the police, and the police found somebody, they had enough evidence to arrest that person, and they turned the person over to the courts for prosecution. That's what cleared by arrest means. Cleared by exceptional means they were going to arrest the person, but they were prevented from doing so by circumstances outside their control, such as the suspect died or the suspect fled to another jurisdiction and they were denied extradition. Okay, so in some sense, this is a measure of the success of the police. Among violent crimes, about 45% of the ones that are known to the police are ever cleared. So that means the majority of violent crimes, the police never arrest anyone for it. Among property crimes, it's around 17.6%. So if somebody steals your stuff, there's a less than 1/5 chance that the police will ever arrest anyone for that. Among all crimes, The statistic is around 21.7%, right? So again, it's around a fifth. If you commit a crime in general, you have about a 1/5 chance that the police will arrest you for it, and an 80% chance that you will get away scot-free. So this is not very impressive quality protection. Okay, you might wonder how the anarchist system would deal with organized crime. Now, in any system, there will probably continue to be crime organizations. No system is going to completely solve social problems, but a reasonable argument can be made that organized crime would actually be a smaller problem. The reason for this is that criminal organizations derive most of their revenues from the sale of certain goods and services that are presently illegal, particularly these so-called vice crimes, prostitution, gambling, and especially recreational drugs. That's how these organizations get their money. Now, they can only make money on these things because they're illegal, right? So if you look at the example of the alcohol prohibition era, so Al Capone, this big gangster who was selling alcohol, he got rich during the Prohibition era when alcohol was illegal. After Prohibition was repealed, then he couldn't make money on it anymore. And that's because these criminals, they don't have particular business skills. It's not that Al Capone was really good at making alcohol. It's that he was good at evading the police or fighting with the police or just like finding people who were willing to defy the law and risk going to jail and things like that. That's his skill. That's the skill of these crime organizations. So they're not going to have any advantage in a world in which the things that they're providing are perfectly legal. Then there would just be no need for them. Okay, and these goods and services, things like prostitution, gambling, and recreational drugs would probably be legal under anarchy. The legalization of these products would deal a much greater blow to organized crime than anything we could expect in the status quo from like, the FBI running sting operations and prosecuting criminals and so on. What about this? Why won't the protection agencies just become extortion agencies? Why won't they just start extorting their customers and not protecting them? And the basic answer to this is that, well, then the customers would hire a different protection agency, right? So it's the importance of competition again. Now compare and contrast what happens with the government. What if the government decides to just become an extortion agency, which, well, perhaps it already is. Perhaps taxation is just a form of extortion. Now, you can, in principle, maybe get a different government, but it's extremely costly and difficult. Very often, you can't go to the country that you would like to go to because there are immigration restrictions all over the world. So getting a different government is extremely difficult. But in the anarcho-capitalist society, if there are multiple protection agencies operating in the same area, it's not so costly and difficult to get a different protection agency. Another worry that you might have is, why won't the protection agency become monopolized? Now, many people appear to have this view that capitalism naturally results in monopoly, that if you just leave the free market to go by itself without a government to restrain it, then naturally most industries get monopolized. This is not, in fact, true. So in reality, almost all monopolies that we see in the economy are ones that were created and enforced by the government. It's extremely difficult to attain a monopoly in a free market. All right, so now to explain this, note that in economic theory, the marginal cost of production, so marginal cost of producing some particular good or service, they will typically go down at first and then go up. So there are some kinds of economies of scale where it's more efficient to produce a large quantity of something. There are certain kind of fixed costs that you have to undertake in order to start producing something, like the cost of building a factory. But then after you attain the most efficient size, then growing your company beyond that makes it less efficient. And this is because, well, there's sort of like increased bureaucracy, duplication of effort, and things like this that occur in a large company. Very large companies become less efficient than moderate-sized companies. Now, the most efficient size for a company depends upon the industry. It depends particularly on what the fixed costs are. So like in the auto industry, for example, the most efficient size is pretty large because an automobile factory is very expensive and turns out thousands of cars. But the protection agency is different. In the protection agency, the most efficient size is probably pretty small. The reason for that is that there are not large fixed costs. So you don't have to build a big factory in order to efficiently provide protection. The costs are you just have to hire a staff and give them equipment, which is probably not going to be extremely expensive. So probably the most efficient size economically for a protection agency is very small, and therefore there might be hundreds, even thousands of different protection agencies operating in the same area, and that just makes it extremely unlikely that a monopoly can be attained. The problem is that as your company grows, it becomes less efficient, so it becomes harder for you to continue competing with the smaller and more efficient organizations. Now, in the status quo, it is possible to attain a monopoly and not necessarily so difficult because in the status quo, you can lobby the government for special favors. If you have a very large firm, then you have the ability to go to the government to hire lobbyists and get them to go there and influence legislation and regulations to make it so that they favor large companies over small companies. And that's really the best way. Like if you're trying to monopolize an industry or just reduce competition, really the best way is to go lobby the government. And that's something that larger companies have more of an advantage at, right? But it's not something that would be available in the anarcho-capitalist society. Now you might wonder, well, maybe a bunch of different protection agencies will form a cartel. So a cartel is a situation where there's not a single business in the industry, but there's a collection of businesses that have made an agreement with each other. And so they make this agreement typically to raise prices. And so they will decide to set the prices at the level that they would be at if there was a monopoly. And then if they just all stick to the agreement, then they can all get outsized profits. Okay, now the problem with this is it's very difficult. Well, the problem for the cartel members, the problem for society is that they're paying too much money. But the problem for the cartel members is it's very difficult to enforce the cartel because each member has an incentive to defect against the other members. In other words, to violate the agreement. Because if all the other people in your industry are charging a really high price, a price that's above what the competitive market price would be, that means that if just you defy the cartel and set a price that's significantly lower, then you can get a ton of business. You can lure away the business from all these other people because they're all charging really high prices. So, and it would be in your interest to do that. So it's in the interest of each member of the cartel to not follow the agreement. Okay, now in reality, the most likely way of enforcing a cartel agreement is, again, to lobby the government. If there's a government, then the members of the cartel can send, they could send lobbyists there to say, hey, will you please enforce this so that none of us defect against the agreement, and then we can all have this higher price. Okay, now how's that in fact happened? Yes, so one example that David Friedman gives is during the 1970s, there was a government agency called the Civil Aeronautics Board, the precursor of the FAA, which it regulated the airlines, and they set prices. They set minimum as well as maximum prices. And during that time, the prices of airline tickets were much more expensive than they were after the deregulation. So after Reagan came in and deregulated the airline industry, prices dropped by a lot. Now, this is a suggestion that appears in some of the literature about anarcho-capitalism. So one author suggested that the cartel members might deny extended protection to non-cartel members. So what they meant by this is customers of a given agency will not always be in a place where they could plausibly be protected by that agency. So they might be visiting a different neighborhood where there's a different protection agency that provides security there. And so extended protection is where the agency that's providing protection in an area provides protection even to people who are not their own customers, but who happen to be in that area. Right, so here's a suggestion of how the cartel members might enforce their agreement against people, against other protection agencies who would violate the agreement. It's that they would retaliate by not providing extended protection for the customers of the non-cartel agencies. Okay, but this is not a very plausible way of enforcing the agreement, because if they did that, then their own customers would probably want to leave them, because people who own property typically do not only want themselves to be safe. They also want the other people that they've invited on their property to be safe. So if you have guests over to your house, you typically also want them to be protected. Or if you run a business, you have other people coming into the business, like potential customers, you typically want them to be safe as well. So if there's a protection agency that says, okay, so we will protect you, but we won't protect any of your customers on your property, the business owner would say, screw that, and he would not hire that protection agency. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between homeowners associations and governments, and that's because one of the ways that security would likely be provided is that there would be these local homeowners associations within a particular neighborhood or in an apartment building or a condominium complex, and they would likely hire a security guard company. Okay, now there are these HOAs in our present society, but there would probably be more of them in the non-governmental society because there would be more need for them. And now you might wonder whether these homeowners associations count as governments. That's again kind of a semantic question, so it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what you want to call it. But what matters is that it does differ in two important ways from the traditional governmental system that we currently have. The first difference is when you get an HOA, you get it voluntarily, i.e. you sign an actual real contract, not like the fictional social contract. There's like an actual physical contract where somebody can show it to you. And the other important difference is competition. Right, so with homeowners associations, there can be multiple different ones within not too far distance of each other, so that if you don't like the HOA, you can move, and it's not nearly as difficult or costly as it is in the case of trying to move away from your government. If you don't like the government of your country, moving away is really expensive and really difficult. You generally have to leave your job, you have to leave behind your family, your friends, you might have to leave behind your culture. You might have to go to a place where you don't even speak the language, so extremely high costs. In the case of a homeowners association, the costs are much less. There are costs if you want to move. If you live in a particular place and you don't like the HOA and you want to move, if you own the house there are costs to selling it. So probably have to take thousands of dollars in transaction costs because you have to pay a real estate agent or whatever. But that is vastly less than the cost of moving to a completely different country. Right? So there's much more competition among homeowners associations than there is among governments of countries. And so in conclusion, anarcho-capitalism has a reasonable way of providing security and protecting individuals against crime.